Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Monday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. It is certainly great to have you with me and to be back with you. Uh, Pardon me, before we get into the video, I want to remind you of my two-book special for the month of June. The End of the Law, Torah to Telos, this is volume number 1, and then Temple to Telos, which is a later edition. And both of these have to do with the feast days now. We're currently examining the feast days of Israel and how they're related to eschatology. We're currently talking about the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. Well, anyway, if you were to purchase both of these books separately and pay shipping separately, all right, you would pay a significant amount of money. Shipping charges anymore are crazy. Okay, but for the month of June 2024, U.S. orders only, all right, go to my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com. I'm not even going to tell you how much you're going to save, all right, but it's a chunk of money. So take advantage of my special offer on these two books. And by the way, some of you have asked, hey, Don, why don't you've got these 5 books on the issue of Torah to Telos. Why don't you make a package deal on all 5 books? It's a great idea, by the way. And so sometime in the near future, I'm going to be offering the entire package of Torah to Telos books, all 5 volumes. And I'll guarantee you I'm going to save you some money. In the meantime, get these 2 volumes. You'll be awfully glad that you did. Okay, special announcement. I'm going to have one video this week. Here's the reason why. On Wednesday, my wonderful, beautiful bride and I will be celebrating our 55th wedding anniversary. Just absolutely does not seem possible that we have been married that long. But as the Proverbs writer says, the man who finds a good wife has found a treasure beyond measure. And that is what I found in June of 1969. I was 19, she was 17. We were just a couple of kids. But here we are 55 years later. And that was absolutely one of the best decisions I've ever made in my life. You know, she has been and continues to be by my side through thick and thin. She is the very best friend I have in this world. She is my confidant. She truly is my soul mate. And it's just, it's the most enriching, the most fulfilling, the most gratifying, and the most, quote, happy producing, unquote, situations in my entire life. So we've decided to take a few days off, beginning tomorrow, Tuesday. And I wanted to use today just sort of kind of to announce that I will not be with you Tuesday through Friday of this week. Now, Lord willing, nothing happens, then I'll be back with you next week, a week from today, all right? But in the meantime, I just want to let you know, beginning tomorrow, like I said, we're going to take a few days off. We're going to combine a bit of vacation with anniversary is what we're doing, all right? And I got to tell you, we don't have all that many plans. We've talked about this before, and we say, well, okay, if we go here and if we go there, if we take a trip here, take a trip there, then when we get there, all we're going to do is go out to eat, go back to the hotel room. Maybe go to a movie, go back to the hotel room, and spend an awful lot of money. And so, in other words, we're not going to do anything in a different venue, a different state, etc., that we don't already do at home. I mean, after all, the whole point is to be together. The whole point is not what we do in another state or another city. The whole point is being together and being with one another. So we don't, we're not going to go off someplace exotic and try to spend a bunch of money. We're just going to kick back and enjoy one another here. Right here in Oklahoma. There you go. So be aware of that. Now then, this will serve as kind of a concluding video on the question of whether or not the atonement was finished at the cross. Just recently I've had a fellow attack me as a false teacher on YouTube, pardon me, YouTube and Facebook both, for saying that the atonement was not finished until the parousia of Christ. Well, I simply base my teaching upon Hebrews chapter 9, as it gives the Old Covenant typological Day of Atonement practices. The high priest offered the sacrifice, killed the sacrifice, entered into the most holy place, and to appear in the presence of God for the people, and then came back out to pronounce atonement completed. Salvation completed. And I'm supposedly a heretic for this, you understand. And yet that's the very three practices of the atonement process. And this gentleman initially said, no. The atonement was finished at the cross. Consummated, over with, done. Well, when I pointed out that if that were true, then that means that Jesus didn't even have to go into the most holy place. There to appear in the presence. There to appear in the presence of God for us. Hebrews 9:24. So guess what? We had a debate conversion. The gentleman changed his tune. He didn't tell everybody he changed until I pointed out what a radical change he had made. And then he tried to simply say, well, it's not that big of a change. Really? Yeah, it's a radical change. When you tell me that the atonement is finished at the cross, and it's heretical to say otherwise, and then when I show how wrong that is, you change without telling anybody. Well, the atonement was finished when Jesus went into the most holy place at the ascension. And you tell us that's not really that big of a change? Well, let's see. The cross, the ascension. That's a 2-month difference in time. No difference at all. There's no difference between the sacrifice and the ascension. This is argumentum ad desperatum. So when I pointed out that Christ was supposed to appear a second time apart from sin for salvation, he said, you have to understand all sorts of definition for salvation. That's talking about the deliverance from the Neronian persecution, and that's talking about deliverance from the war. So this gentleman divorces, absolutely 100%, divorces the coming of Christ out of the most holy place from his entrance into the most holy place. And he says the salvation is physical salvation from the Neronian persecution, deliverance from physical death experienced in the war. That means that physical deliverance at the coming of the Lord occurred, according to this gentleman, in AD 66. Do you see how he completely divorces verse 28 from the preceding context? I mean, he takes Jehoiakim's penknife and just slices it. And he divorces it also from Hebrews chapter 10, verse 1, which gives the reason why Christ was to come again, to come out of the most holy place. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 1 says, for, to those who eagerly look for him, he will appear a second time apart from sin for salvation. For, here's the reason. Here's the reason Christ had to come again. For the law being a shadow of good things about to come. So we're supposed to believe that the law and the second coming of Christ out of the most holy place was typified in the Old Testament, but it was his coming for physical salvation, having nothing to do with sin and the atonement, even though the atonement was all about sin and forgiveness. And even though the three practices of the atonement were sacrifice, entrance into the most holy place, and egress from the most holy place, this gentleman divorces, verse 28, and the coming out of the most holy place from the other two actions. Argumentum ad desperatum. And in reality, he divorces it. In fact, he literally ridiculed me for appealing to Hebrews chapter 10, verse 1. And the word for. Well, I didn't focus just on for, but it's legitimate to do so. I focused on the fact that it says Christ was going to come again the second time for the law having a shadow of good things to come, or being a shadow of good things to come. I've said this many, many times, folks. It is absolutely astounding how desperate people will get when they're trying to salvage their preconceived ideas. But now, back to the question. Was the atonement consummated at the cross? I want you to consider this very, very simple fact. This gentleman and many others on YouTube who made comment during this series of videos. Oh, no, the atonement was finished at the cross. Well, wait a minute. The cross was the Passover sacrifice, right? Pardon me. I don't know of anybody that denies that. Oh, pardon me. I don't know of anyone that denies that. Okay, so the cross was the Passover. Now, did it also serve as the sacrifice for the atonement? Yes, it did. In rabbinic writings, and I discussed this last Friday night on Preterist Apologetics with Mike Sullivan. Excellent book by Tom Holland, The Divine Marriage. In that book, Tom Holland discusses how the Jews saw an atonement element in the Passover. But here's the question. Did the Jews see atonement consummated at the time of Passover? The answer to that is unequivocally, undeniably, irrefutably, no, they did not. Period. End of story. It's not even debatable. And think about this. If the atonement was finished at the cross, if the atonement was finished by the offering of the Passover lamb, to put it like that, why was there a separate and distinct Day of Atonement 4 months after the Passover? Do you get the point? Do you catch the power of that? Passover, 4 months later, Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, was not completed at the offering of Passover. Let me reiterate. Passover had an element of atonement, just like many, many of the sacrifices under Torah had an atonement element to them. I've already pointed out in Leviticus chapter 9, I think it's verse 12, if memory serves me correctly, as Moses, Aaron, and Aaron's sons were being consecrated and dedicated for the service in the temple, they offered several bloody sacrifices. Now, mind you, this is not on Yom Kippur, okay? But they offered those sacrifices, and the Lord said to make atonement for sin. Well, does that mean that they didn't have to have a Day of Atonement? No, that would be ridiculous. And when you read through the book of Leviticus, you find this terminology to make atonement for sin over and over and over and over in regard to many of the feast days. Well, then, that must mean the atonement was made when they offered the sin offering, for instance, on, Feast of Tabernacles or Feast of Pentecost. They offered those sacrifices, if memory serves me correctly, to make atonement for sin. They offered sacrifices every Sabbath morning and every Sabbath evening to make atonement for sin. Folks, do you catch the point here? So was Passover, or did Passover have an element to it of atonement? Yes. Just like many, many, many other of the sacrificial days had an element of atonement to them. They were not the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement was separate and distinct, and it was not the Passover. It was not the Feast of Weeks. It was not the Day of Feast of Unleavened Bread. It was not Pentecost. It was not Yom Teruah, the Feast of Trumpets. It was not the Feast of Harvest. A separate and distinct feast day that came 10 days after the Feast of Trumpet. Now, by the way, was it integrally related to the Feast of Trumpets? Absolutely. Trumpets and atonement in many ways went together, but they're not the same. So let me ask you a question. If the atonement was completed at Passover, why was there a distinct, separate Day of Atonement? Furthermore, if you say that the atonement was made at the cross, then you are creating a radical temporal disjunction. Because the final 3 feast days of Israel's festal calendar went like this. Feast of Trumpet, 10 days later, Yom Kippur, and then Feast of Trumpets. So if you rip Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, out of its chronological flow, then you are totally destroying the chronological flow of the feast days. Yom Kippur didn't happen until the Feast of Trumpets was over. So let me ask you a question. Was Yom Kippur already fulfilled? Meaning, was the day of fulfillment already, the day of judgment already fulfilled when Jesus died on the cross to make atonement? If you're going to argue that the Day of Atonement was finished at the cross, then why don't you have to argue that the Day of Judgment was over at the cross? Not only that, why don't you argue that the harvest likewise took place immediately after the cross? I mean, after all, in the typology and in the listing the final 3 feast days, Feast of Trumpets comes very quickly after the atonement. You see the problem? So what it says when people argue the Day of Atonement was completed at the cross, then they're saying there should not have been a separate Day of Atonement. That's essentially what they're doing. And if somebody were to jump up and say, well, Don, that's exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying the Day of Atonement was completely, totally fulfilled at the cross. There was no further Day of Atonement actions to be necessary. Then what happens to Yom Kippur, Teruah, what happens to Yom Teruah, the Day of Trumpets, the judgment. What gives you the right to take atonement out of its chronological flow and say, well, the middle of the last three feasts, that was fulfilled back there. Oh, by the way, we're still waiting for the judgment, the Feast of Trumpet, and we're still waiting for the harvest, or at least they were. Folks, I'm sorry. That doesn't even make good nonsense. The reality is, in the New Testament, they were waiting for the coming of Christ out of the most holy place to declare salvation. The salvation that was purchased, to be sure, through Jesus' death on the cross. To apply and to announce the salvation purchased through Christ, entering into the most holy place, there to appear in the presence of God for us. I am not by any stretch of the imagination saying that the second coming of Christ is unrelated to his death, his entrance into the most holy place. I had one fellow tell me, oh, you're just disparaging the cross. No, I'm not. I'm pointing out that the atonement was a three-step process. And that's exactly, precisely, and irrefutably what Hebrews chapter 9 teaches. Okay, I'm done for today. A little bit longer than normal. All right, no extra charge for that. So, thank you again for joining me. Please do not forget, order these two books. You'll be glad you did. Lord willing, I love it. My wife's and I are going to enjoy a few days of vacation. I'll see you on Monday.